All right. So 90 years ago today, the newly formed Regina Natural History Society adopted a constitution establishing the society's aims. And at that time, it was the study of natural science and conservation of wildlife. And it's incredible how much we've grown since then. As I said earlier, I've been going to the archives. We are hoping the committee that's working on some 90th anniversary things, that we will be able to present an update to Nature and Trust, which was described our first 60 years. And so we're hoping to do an addendum to that to catch the last 30. So I just wanted to give you a little history lesson. And this month we're talking mostly about our youth programming. And so when I looked back to the very beginning with Nature and Trust, it talked about activities for young people of all ages have been and continue to be an important part of our society's work. The first program recorded was in 1934, when schools and other youth groups were contacted and invited to tour the museum. Two characteristics are evident over the years, the first being the ebb and flow of youth activities. There would be a spurt of activity with impressive results, followed by a lull, a discussion of ways and means of interesting youth, and then another leader would appear bringing a revival of interest. The second characteristic was the frequent involvement of staff from the Saskatchewan Museum of Natural History in these activities. It's not always clear which hat leaders wore, the museums or the societies, because that really was the society in the early days. One museum staff member by the name of Richard Fife combined his interest in falconry and young people by having them demonstrate their skills at flying live falcons in the auditorium as part of some of the History Society's program. So, and now that's something to think about next time you're sitting in that auditorium, free-flying falcons. So that's just great. The marsh field trips were always a perennial favorite. And this one I really love. Was a very popular children's program at the museum in the early 60s. It consisted of nature quizzes and drawings based on the museum's exhibits, with the Regina Natural Historical Society providing the prizes. As many as 300 children took part in this activity on a Saturday afternoon. Children loved the program. Their parents loved the program. They would happily drop the kids off and then they would go away. And they didn't actually often come back on time, rarely came back on time. So Saturday afternoon, leave the kids at the museum and away you go. So turned out that a lot of the patrons weren't really thrilled with the children running rampant, I guess. Well, must have been some supervision in the museum. And because of the parents not actually coming back to get them in a timely fashion, the program had to be terminated. But it sounded like it would have been great fun. And then in 1968, Lauren Scott, a museum employee, became convener of the Society's youth program. And in 1970, he reported that 600 children were reached by the program. The junior naturalists were involved in a bluebird nest project, field trips to such places as the grouse dancing grounds, bird identification, as well as participating in adult programs by giving slide talks. So then the youth programs ebbed again during the 80s, and but for National Wildlife Week in 1990, Society volunteers in cooperation with Regina area schools took 350 children on nature walks along the shores of Wascana Lake. And then there was, in the subsequent years up just from Nature and Trust, that there was Nature Regina volunteers put together 200 bird feeders with the local scouts and guides. The 59th Scout Troop helped at Hidden Valley. So I'm not sure if it was for a badge or if they were working something off, but anyway, they were out there. And then the WOW Festival, Wings Over Wascana, began in 2005. And Nature Regina was involved with that right from the very beginning and continue to be involved with that. And so there's always been that involvement there, and particularly the school and public days where the Nature Regina volunteers were out doing things with the school kids. And so over the years, we've had many great activities for all ages, including early morning bird hikes, kite flying, arts and crafts, nature face treasure hunts, live animal, bird, and reptile talks, owl pellet dissection, ducks unlimited pond dipping, goat grazing, lunch hour guests, native plant information and giveaway, invasive species identification, guided nature hikes, as well as a specialized nature app and activities such as solar oven baking and geocaching. And then of course, the great sit with the local bird expert, Frank Switzer, was held every year at the Wascana, at the Wings over Wascana. So Frank kept a tally of all the bird species. And when I read about that, I was just completely amazed that someone would sit out there that long in the park. And I'm not sure all the ins and outs of that. Gary, you might be more familiar with what happened there. But anyway, so those are some of the things that went on as part of WOW and our involvement. And then, of course, the one year that there wasn't the conservation grant, there was an applicant for the conservation grant. And Jared Clark was the in charge of the Young Naturalist programs. So he applied for and received $650 from Nature Regina to buy 44 Sibley field guides. And I like to think that those kids are still out there somewhere enjoying birds. So that's where we were to the first 60 years with kids. So just that kids have always been important to the society, will continue to be important. They've always been welcomed on field trips and other events. But then in 2019, the board was able to get a grant from Nature Canada Nature Canada. And that's when we hired Shannon Chernick, who designed, developed, and built capacity with the Organization for Youth Activities. So that's where we are now, which we're really proud of, which is the Get Outside Kids Club, the Get Outside Preschool, and then just the Get Outside for everyone else, for families and stuff. So that's a bit of our history around the youth, and we hope to keep engaging them. So on to our show. Dana M. Green is here to talk to us about community ecology of North American bats. Dana was born and raised in Missouri, where she completed her undergraduate degree in wildlife biology at Missouri State University. While there, she was a member of two different research labs, Behavioral Ecology of Salamanders Lab and the Bat Ecology Lab. After completing her Bachelor of Science, Dana moved to Flagstaff, Arizona, where she joined the PASH lab studying vocal communication in grasshopper mice. While there, Dana helped organize the March for Science. Flagstaff was the volunteer coordinator for a tiger conservation project and helped start a nonprofit focused on falconry and raptor conservation. Dana is currently living in Saskatchewan, where she is earning her PhD in biology. She's co-supervised by Dr. Aaron Bearwald and Dr. Mark Brigham. Right before her first field season in 2019, Dana became permanently blind in her right eye and has since been adjusting to life as being visually disabled. Dana focuses her research questions surrounding the intersections of ecology, behavioral physiology, and conservation. Her PhD work is exploring the community ecology of migratory bats in Canada. While earning her PhD, Dana has become an avid science communicator surrounding topics of biology, ecology, and in particular bats. Additionally, her love of falconry followed her, and she became a falconer in 2022 in Saskatchewan, and actually did a wonderful presentation for the Christmas bird count for kids for nature, Saskatchewan in January. So please welcome Dana.
All right. Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really happy to be presenting today. Any opportunity that I get to talk about bats, I usually hop on it because bats are awesome. And I've been doing a lot here, even through the pandemic. We've really been able to keep the lab busy in the birds and bats lab, run by Mark Brigham. So first, I kind of want to start this off with a place, because the way that my thesis has gone with how everything has happened over the past few years, Cypress has really become a very special place to me because of what happens with the bats there. So my thesis is focused primarily on migratory bat species, And beginning in the spring, both hoary and silver-haired bats migrate to the Cypress Hills, potentially migrating up to 1,000 kilometers just to be in the Cypress Hills. And then we have this much smaller little brown myotis, which is a regional migrant, and something that currently is unknown in the province is where they go to hibernate. So the Cypress Hills, where I specifically work in West Block, straddles the provincial border between Alberta and Saskatchewan. If you've ever been to the Cypress Hills, there's probably a higher probability that you've been to Center Block. I am personally much more partial to West Block because it's not nearly as built up for commercial camping as it is in Center Block. And if you ever have the opportunity, you have to go. It's just an absolutely stunning place. And it's incredibly unique. It rises above the prairie landscape over 400 meters. And it's something that I like to call a sky island, which is a term that I actually picked up while working in the desert Southwest. They have these mountain ranges that go above the desert landscape, and the ecosystem changes with that elevation. And we see the exact same things in the Cypress Hills. It rises above the prairie landscape and is almost like a boreal type habitat compared to the rest of the surrounding prairies. So it's an incredibly unique location, smack dab in the middle of the Canadian prairies. So when I started my thesis work, I was predominantly focused on the migratory bats that come into the area, the hoary bat and the silver-haired bat. Hoary bats are the largest bat that we can find in Canada, though they're definitely not as large as a flying fox. If you put your two hands outstretched together, I don't know if you can see what I'm doing up on the screen or not, but if you put your fingers totally splayed out like that, that's about how wide the wingspan is of a hoary bat. And silver-haired bats are probably about half that size. So they're still quite small in comparison. The hoary bat's going to be the one that is the most migratory. They can move and travel up to 1,000 kilometers along their migratory pathways. And similarly, silver-haired bats can migrate that far, but they're a really interesting species because it's almost like there's population differences or group differences, or maybe it's individuals. Some are not very migratory at all and will only go a couple hundred of kilometers, while others will migrate 500, 800, or 1,000 kilometers. So they're kind of a very interesting migratory species. There's all sorts of unanswered ecological questions that we could ask there. So these are the two species that I was mostly focused on. And for one very big reason. And that is while I am a huge proponent of green energy, wind energy being one of those things, the development of wind energy facilities does not have to be at the expense of our wildlife. And as it stands, the hoary nor the silver-haired bats are listed as threatened or endangered in Canada, but their populations, especially that of the hoary bat, are drastically declining. This is a quote from a recent publication that came out that if current fatality rates of the hoary bats at wind energy facilities were to persist, then it may be that their populations are possibly high enough to have already caused substantial decline. And what they've predicted is potential extinction risk in as little as 50 years. So this is a very real conservation issue. And this publication was a population-wide model, and smaller studies that looked at regional scales also have been finding similar things, that our migratory bats are in drastic decline. So it made me think about the Cypress Hills. Whenever I've been out in the Cypress Hills, we are catching hoary and silver-haired bats in abundance. And so I ask the question, do we see these similar declines on a local abundance scale that we see on larger spatial scales for these migratory species? And this actually brings me to something really special, yet again, about the Cypress Hills, but also about Regina, and in particular, Dr. Mark Brigham. So there might be a lot of familiar faces that you see in this picture here. The one that you see in the middle with the bright orange shirt with the big old grin on his face is Mark Brigham. And he has been leading research out at the Cypress Hills for over 20 years. He's been working there since the early 1990s and has data going back that entire time. So I was able to set up a collaborative research project with his previous students. I was able to get data from 5 different researchers spanning a 20-year time frame. And all of these records are pretty much done in the exact same way. Everything has been done with misnetting surveys practically along the same 10-kilometer stretch of the Battle Creek that intersects West Block of Cypress Hills. There are very, very few data sets that exist like this. So it was an incredible opportunity to look at local abundance of bats. And for those that are interested in kind of the nitty-gritty details of how we put together our different models, we corrected for a bunch of different variables, trying to take into account time of year, whether they're adults or juveniles, who was netting during that year. So all sorts of different things. And if folks have questions, I'm happy to talk about it later, but we don't need to go into the nitty-gritty statistics. What we found across that 20-year time frame, spanning from 2000 until 2019, was that there was this is a probability of how likely this is to occur. So there was only a 7% probability that we've seen a decrease in hoary bat abundance. There was only a 15% probability that we've seen a 30% decrease. However, when it comes to increases in local abundance, we saw a probability of 40% that it's increased by at least 30%, and potentially upwards of 41% of increasing by at least 30%. Indicating that there's a very strong likelihood that we are getting more hoary bats. We see this same pattern with our silver-haired bats, but it's even more extreme. There was only a 1% probability that there was at least a decrease of 30%, but a 96% chance that we've seen an increase in silver-haired bats by 30% or more. So it's pretty incredible, the likelihood that we are seeing increases of these migratory species. So there's no evidence of this decrease of hoary bats over the 20-year time frame, but rather that there's either no change in local abundance for our hoaries and a very high chance that our silver-haired bats are increasing. Again, this is actually highlighting the importance of the Cypress Hills itself. It has been supported time and time again that on large spatial scales, on regional spatial scales, when it comes to the overall population of hoary bats in particular, and silver-haired bats to a similar extent, is that they are decreasing population-wise. They are decreasing. But the Cypress Hills is an incredible location where these bats have an abundance of resources that they are able to come to year after year and use as very reliable habitat that has reliable resources. It's one of the very few known reproductive locations for these species. I have had the distinct privilege of netting all across North America, from West Virginia and Virginia to the southwestern United States, and now north. Well, granted, there's still a lot of north I have yet to explore, but now in Saskatchewan. And there's never been anywhere else where I have netted hoaries and silver-haired bats like you can in the Cypress Hills, let alone reproductive females. These are females that are pregnant when they arrive and give birth to their pups in the Cypress Hills. So the Cypress Hills is supporting large numbers of these migratory bats. Silver-haireds are likely increasing. So this is going to be an ever more important location for migratory bat conservation. So that little research project took me through the pandemic, let's say. And that was when research and doing sciences, whether it was out in the field or on university, drastically changed. You know, we weren't allowed to go out to the field station for a year. We weren't allowed to go to campus for a long time. So we couldn't get a lot of work done, but it let me work on that research there. And working on that really got me asking a lot of questions about how these two species are able to coexist during such an important time. I've kind of gone into a little bit of the ecology of these migratory species, but for all intents and purposes, they're quite comparable. They are both highly migratory. They both have an incredibly similar diet from previous research, and they are both tree roosting species. So these are tree roosting, migratory, like beetle and moth eating bats. Sorry, I'm having a dog trying to beg for my attention right now. Sorry, buddy. So they're very similar, but there's a principle in ecology, which more or less says that two organisms can't occupy the same ecological niche. There can't be two organisms that have the same job. So these bats have to be different enough to not be directly competing with each other. But how? How are these very similar species able to coexist during such an important time, being the time where they are having their pups and lactating and giving birth and rearing their young? So from 2019, 2021, and 2022, we were able to collect fur, wing photos, and fecal samples from almost all of the hories, silver-haired bats, along with the little brown myotis as well, which I will get into a little bit later. But with those samples, I was able to ask, do they share similar foraging strategy and thus diet? Are hoary and silver-haired bats potentially competing for the same resources? And if they are competing, does one potentially have higher cortisol levels? Does the size matter when it comes to the amount of glucocorticoids or different hormones that are expressed when experiencing environmental stress? And will we see differences between adults and juveniles? So first I looked at wing photos, lots and lots, hundreds and hundreds of wing photos, which can give a great idea for migratory flight efficiency. But on the local ecology scale, it can give us an idea of foraging mode. Very long, narrow wings are going to be more adept to open spaces, where short and broader wings are better for clutter. In those different habitats, you're going to get an assemblage of different types of insects. With our fecal collection, we were able to do diet analysis via microscopy and DNA analysis as well. And then with fur samples, I was able to, while I was stuck not being able to go out into the field or have access to campus, I set up a lot of collaborations. So my thesis has been incredibly collaborative with brilliant researchers spread out across Canada and across the world. So I was able to work with Dr. Bjorn Wissel and do an isotopic analysis. And this gives us an idea of their isotopic niche. And that can give us not a direct comparison, but it can give us a great idea of their ecological niche. Stable nitrogen isotopes are going to change with trophic level. So it's kind of like the bigger, the beefier the bug, the higher concentration of the stable nitrogen isotope that you will see. The carbon scale, on the other hand, gives us a better idea of terrestrial versus aquatic systems. Then I was able to do cortisol extractions as well. So with those fur samples that I collected, I was able to do both of these things. So this collaboration started off by me contacting the first author of this paper, and she set me up with Dr. Gabriella Mastromonaco out of the Toronto Zoo. And they have been running the fur cortisol extractions for this project across the last couple of years. Now, when it comes to wing morphometrics and foraging ecology, I looked at two distinct things, the aspect ratio and the wing loading. The aspect ratio is going to be the square of the wingspan divided by the area, and it gives us an idea of how long and narrow the wings are. So that's flight efficiency. If they are longer and narrower, they can fly longer. This is from 1 year's worth of results that shows that our hoary bats have a much higher aspect ratio when compared with our silver-haired bats. Now, this has actually been supported numerous times. This is not surprising to me, but it's nice to know that my data are holding up. Now, next for wing loading, that's giving us an idea of the pressure on the wings. So higher wing loading is going to mean faster flight. And as I expected, our hoary bats, which are again the more migratory species, have a higher wing loading, and so they are faster flyers. Great for migration. Now, this is also going to give us an idea that our hoary bats, not dogs. So sorry, guys. I'm house sitting, which is why I am not there tonight. Many apologies. So our hoary bats are going to be faster flyers. They have those long, narrow wings, which means they are going to be more adept to foraging in open areas. So they may be foraging on different things compared to our silver-haired bats. So long and slender versus short and broad. And we have some nice photo comparisons for you there. Now, what did our dietary findings do? So we did attempt, and Kirsten knows this very well, that we attempted DNA analysis. Josh, my research assistant, really spearheaded this effort, and so I really want to give him a good shout out. Sadly, we are novices when it comes to DNA extraction, and we tried very hard, but did not successfully extract any DNA from our fecal samples, and so we did microscopy. This gives us a very coarse idea of the diets of both of these bats. So these are not species specific, but these are group specific. So overall, our horis and our silvers have an incredibly similar diet. Beetles and moths are the predominant insects found in our fecal samples, followed up by flies. A follow-up that we are doing with this analysis is that we've actually just sent all of our remaining fecal samples to the Species from Feces lab in Flagstaff, Arizona. And so we are about to get a very detailed description of what specifically these bats are eating. So I'm very excited for those results to be coming in. So for our isotopic niche, like I previously very briefly stated, it's highly correlated with the trophic or ecological niche, but they're not one for one, but it can give us an idea on if they're occupying the same ecological space. So this is for the adult hoary and silver-haired bats. Hoary bats are the large black circle with the black points inside, and our silver-haired bats are the ones in red. And what we see here is that our silver-haired bats are actually nested quite tightly within the isotopic niche of hoary bats. But what does this mean? Our hoary bats have a much larger breadth on both the nitrogen scale, which is on our y-axis, and our carbon scale, which is on our x-axis. So what this is telling me is that our hoary bats are foraging on a wider variety of insects. They may be foraging more generally when compared with our silver-haired bats. So while the silver-haired bats are nested right there in the middle, they may not be directly competing with one another because of the breadth of insects that our hoary bats seem to be foraging on. Additionally, I looked at this with just our juveniles as well, and we see something very similar. And what I want to note is that up until this point, the fur that's been growing on these juvenile bats, they grew while nursing on their mothers. So the cortisol that has been deposited within their fur at this time is actually coming directly from their mother. So we see something very similar. Now, when it comes to just straight cortisol levels, which can be an indication of potential physiological or environmental stress, we see that our silver-haired bats do have, and this is statistically significant as well, higher cortisol levels compared to our hoary bats. And so that got me asking a little bit more questions, which is why. So first I pieced it apart with adults and juveniles. There were no differences between any of the groups except for our juvenile silver-haired bats. It's our juvenile silver-haireds that seems to be pulling up the cortisol levels of this group. So if we look at it with just between the sexes and the two species, so we have Lacey, which is Lasiurus cinereus, that's our hoary bats, and Lano, which is Lasionicterus noctivagans, are silver-haired bats. So while we see a lot of breadth with our female silver-haireds, there's a lot of variation within their cortisol levels, but there's really no statistical differences between sexes or between species and sexes here. Now, just looking within species itself, this is our hoary bat's cortisol by age. And this is kind of what I would expect to see. Again, our juveniles would have been nursing on their mothers at this time. So it makes sense to me that the juveniles nested nice and tight within the adult range of cortisol level here. But this is where it gets interesting. Within our silver-haired bats, the juveniles have far greater cortisol levels in concentration compared to our adults. And I do not currently have a good explanation for this finding right now. What I'm very excited for is that I just got the results for 2 more years worth of cortisol data from all of our bat species, not just our hories and our silvers, but also for our little browns as well. So I'm very excited to see if this result holds up, and then start trying to figure out how to explain this as to what kind of environmental stressors or what these juvenile silver-haired bats are experiencing that might be driving up these cortisol levels. Now, there was the does size matter question as well. If you are an adult bat, it did not. So we see absolutely no relationship here. We have almost perfectly straight lines between our cortisol concentrations and the size of our bats. So there was really no effect on our adult bats and therefore cortisol levels. But if you're a juvenile, yet again, we see something interesting. The smaller the juvenile bat, the higher the concentration those cortisol levels are. So again, very excited to be looking at the next 2 years worth of data and to see and explore whether or not some of these trends hold up year after year, and try and figure out what these juveniles are experiencing. So when it comes to the primary parts of my thesis work, it seems like wing morphology suggests different foraging strategies, but diets and isotopic niches are suggesting that they might be kind of similar. And our juvenile silver-haired bats seem to be potentially more physiologically stressed, but more exploration is needed, and I'm really excited to be digging into that data here pretty soon. All right, so that was the start of how my thesis was going, but then more and more questions started popping up about the little brown myotis. And this might, the little brown might sound more familiar to you because this is already an endangered species in Canada. And not only that, but its main conservation concern, white nose syndrome, just hit the province about just a couple of years ago and has started spreading across the province since. I'm very happy to report that we have not had confirmed white nose in the Cypress Hills, and we have not detected any of the fungal spores in the samples that our team has personally collected, which is just fantastic news. So they are endangered in Canada, but we don't know where they hibernate. We don't know how populations are impacted by white nose syndrome yet. And we don't know what their important foraging areas are or how they're really using space. These are a lot of the questions that our lab is now tackling a lot of. So we have some ongoing collaborative research between the University of Regina, Environment and Climate Change Canada, University of New Brunswick, Parks Canada, the Ministry, and the Wildlife Society Canada. So we have a lot of collaboration going on to try and understand some of these questions about the little brown bat as well. But what does a salmon and a bat have in common? It might not come as an intuitive answer to you, but the answer is this man. And this is Dr. Kurt Samways. And he is actually an alumnus of the University of Regina. He did his undergraduate and an honors project with Mark Brigham. And then he actually also did his graduate work at the U of R as well. And he is now an incredibly talented and prolific researcher at the University of New Brunswick. He came and did a seminar at the U of R pre-pandemic, and it got us talking with each other, and we came up with a really cool idea of how to try and answer some of these important questions about bats, especially the little brown bat. And we wrote a grant together, and it got funded by Environment and Climate Change Canada to do a large-scale passive monitoring project. And so the idea is to set up these massive antenna arrays across the Battle Creek and use monitoring technology to try and understand how they're moving across the landscape for foraging, how that affects or is it affected by insect assemblages, how are they moving, all sorts of really interesting questions that we can answer. So we've spent a couple of summers now setting up this massive collaborative project in West Block of the Cypress Hills, and this is still ongoing. So this is an ongoing monitoring project that we've been troubleshooting and perfecting and trying to get to, honestly, to work better for what we're trying to get and accomplish. So we're using these pit tags, and to date, we have pit tagged not only hundreds of little brown myotis in the Cypress Hills, but also hoary bats and silver-haired bats. So we are monitoring all of these bat species within the Cypress Hills using this system. with additional ongoing research, because we're out there almost every year netting, we've had some amazing recaptures. So just a couple of years ago, my research assistant Josh and I recaptured a little brown myotis that we later found the data card for, and it turned out that it was originally captured in 1993 by Martina Kalkunas-Ruppel, who is now the Dean of Science over at the University of Alberta, and she was part of Dr. Brigham's first cohort of graduate students. So it was just a really neat capture for both, just a neat capture for the lab in general. And again, it highlights that bats are coming back to Cypress Hills year after year after year, sometimes 28, 29 years later. Important to note that we captured this bat less than 100 meters away from its original capture site. So it's just really incredible. And on top of that, over the last couple of years, we've also been collecting fur and fecal samples from little brown bats. So I am going to be including those data within the larger scale of my entire thesis. And rather than focused on the long distance migratory bats, be focused on all of the migratory bats of Cypress Hills, exploring those isotopic niches and fur cortisol levels and wing morphometrics. So it can be one all-inclusive story about the bat community within the Cypress Hills. I guess, again, another little good follow-up with our how important the Cypress Hills are is that it's not the first time that it's happened. There was another Japanese 3-year-old bat that was captured in Cyprus as well. You gotta stop. Sorry. Too many dogs. So why is this important? Obviously, hopefully you've picked up why I personally think that this is important. But for migratory bats in general, what happens on submarine grounds will directly influence migration survival. Migration is an incredibly risky animal behavior, and these bats, as juveniles in their first year that can potentially live 30 years, have to be able to survive migrations. Cypress Hills is an incredible spot for these migratory bats. It's potentially a haven with an abundance of resources critical for these species that are using the Cypress Hills for these very important times of their life histories. And overall, aerial insectivores are declining, whether they're hoary bats or silver-haired or little browns, and whether it's because of the increasing different types of energy industry, or whether it's because of pathogens such as white nose syndrome, or because of pesticides and herbicides. We are losing our aerial insectivores at an incredible rate. And it is ever important to find these types of spots that are so abundant in resources and help conserve these habitats to help the species as a whole. Because if we don't, then species like this hoary bat here, we might just actually see them fly off into the darkness and never see them again. So with that, I have an overabundance of people to thank and recognize, and I will take any questions if there is time.